Throughout history, humans have considered ourselves pretty special, far above the animals that many of our cultures teach us that we were placed to command. But even with that, we still treat each other awful, intentionally spreading disease, murder, causing massive devastation and famine for small strategic benefits, massacres, chemical weapons, executions, systemized genocide, and imprisonment. But for just as long as we've been told that we're better than animals, we've also been inventing rules and laws to support this self importance. Things that we consider unchanging rights of all humans. But who exactly get these rights? Why does it matter? And who enforces it, and why is it a bad thing that they do? On this episode of Why Aren't You Talking About This? Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Waitat. I am your host, William, and I will be your guide through perhaps the scariest and most unnerving episode we've ever done to date. And yes, we're doing an episode on horror this week for Nerd. And yes, we talk about taxes, climate change, war, and white supremacy. And this one is scarier. But before we get to that, and yes, it's too late to leave now, I want to thank you so much for listening. It means the world to have the show carpet bombing your brain and eardrums like Middle Eastern war criminals. And no, I'm not talking about the ones that George W. called terrorists. Also, we don't necessarily have any updates. I mean, we have some minor ones. Except, yes, I do have opinions on the attempt to kill Trump, and no, I'm not going to say it here because it's a lot harder to deny when it's your voice saying it on your podcast. Especially when you're a leftist in a country that's quickly going down the road of fascism. I will wait to speak my mind until I'm sitting on a stockpile that make a Christian nationalist that thinks they're being oppressed for not being allowed to marry an 11-year-old start thinking about gun control. Also, I might be taking a podcast break sometime soon. I'm not sure for how long or when exactly, but I have really been running myself ragged again, and I need some time to just realign and figure my shit out. So, sorry if this is the last episode posted for a bit, but yeah, I gotta make sure I'm not posting late, and that I can do things in a way that's not gonna kill me. Just for context, a little bit of an inside scoop. I haven't even started the research for the nerd episode yet this week. And I am recording this the night before this episode is supposed to come out. So that's how kind of fucky things have been. With other episodes, I've been recording like the day of or a day after. So yeah, it's not that like I'm starting to like get tired of the show or anything. It's just with work and having a relationship, and also like trying to do like some side projects and having undiagnosed neurodivergence and being mentally ill. It's a lot to try to do. But it's not me pour my heart out to you hour. So on to the show. Yeah. Yeah, no, I know. Look, I know that we have the First Amendment, but with like the Patriot Act and all, and oh yeah, no, exactly, I agree. Yeah, XCOM name. Oh fuck, sorry, I'm still recording. Ignore that. All right, so this episode we're going to be talking about some human rights. Since we discussed so many human wrongs, let's take a look at some good things. I mean, kinda, not really. We'll see. Alright, so a human right is a right that is inherent to all human beings, regardless of other factors or status, which in theory can't be withheld for any reason. Although, practically, that's where we get kind of but we'll get into that. Before that, let's go through our current human rights that we're afforded. So, first is that all humans are born free and equal in both dignity and rights. All humans have reason and consciousness and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. And yes, this was written in the late 40s, hence the term brotherhood, not humanity, I guess. Second, everyone is entitled to all human rights without distinction of any kind for any reason, including race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth or other status, political, jurisdictional, or international status of the country or territory to which the person belongs. Third, everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security. Fourth, no one shall be held in slavery or servitude, and the slave trade and slavery is to be prohibited in all forms. Fifth, no one shall be subject to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. And if you're not starting to shit and piss and come already, as you realize your nation of choice is already breaking the rules, then you either live somewhere pretty damn nice or you're lying to yourself. If you live in the US, you're just straight up lying to yourself. I'm sorry, but it's true. Alright. Sixth, everyone has the right to recognition everywhere as a person, in like the legal sense. Seventh, everyone is equal before the law and are entitled without any discrimination to equal protection of the law, and are entitled to equal protection against discrimination that violates the Declaration of Human Rights and against incitements of violations of their human rights. Eighth, everyone has the same right to effective remedy, i.e. retribution, for acts violating the fundamental rights granted to them. Ninth, no one is subject to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile. Again, yikes if you live in the U.S. 10th, all people are entitled in full equality to a fair and public hearing by an independent and impartial tribunal, the determination of their rights and obligations and of criminal charges. So, okay. So, we're getting in the weeds here. But basically, these are the ones saying that you can't use the legal system to fuck over people's human rights, and they have to always have access to and be allowed to report violations of their rights. That's what all of that means. Number 11 gets longer, but anyone charged with a penal, prison you pervert, offense, has the right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty at a trial where they have all the guarantees necessary for their defense. Also, no one will be held guilty of a penal offense because of an act or omission that isn't a penal offense under national or international law at the time the crime was committed, nor can you impose a heavier penalty than was imposed when the act was committed. And again, there's a lot there, but basically no takesies backsies on prison charges, and no one can be imprisoned for a dumb sham reason. 12, no one should be subjected to arbitrary interference to their privacy, family, home, or correspondence, and not be subject to attacks on their honor or reputation. Everyone has the right to protection from these interferences and attacks. 13th, everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state and the right to leave or return to any country. 14th, everyone has the right to seek and enjoy asylum, but this right cannot be invoked if being persecuted for non-political crimes or acts contrary to the UN or human rights. So you can't hide in North Korea if you do a war crime. At least not legally. I have a feeling the jurisdictions might be a little iffy if they decide that they like you and they want to keep you. Because, then the whole international community would have to be like, hey, how about you give them back? And then North Korea would just point to China and be like, I don't think I will. Um, and 15th, everyone has the right to their nationality and cannot be deprived of it or denied the right to change their nationality. Which basically means that, like, every nation has to have some way to become a national of their country. Um, which honestly, I feel like that's the only reason why countries like Japan and, if we're being honest, the only other example I can think of off the top of my head is China, Japan, and China. Um, because they both, I mean, currently not super closed door policies, but socially, like, they're very closed door to foreigners. I guess also, like, a lot of Europe is, like, non-Europeans, they're very closed doors too. So I think that's probably the only reason why a lot of those countries have any kind of immigration policy. 16th, men and women of full age, I mean, that means adults, without limitations due to race, nationality, or religion, have the right to marry and have a family and are entitled to equal rights as related to marriage during the duration of the marriage. Marriages can only be entered with the full consent of the intended spouses and family and as a natural and fundamental group unit of society and is entitled to protection. Which I will say, again, we're in the late 40s, and it's slightly yikers on the last part, but I understand because, like, it's basically saying that, like, this group is fundamental to how humans operate. Shit. It's fundamental to how humans operate, and so, like, we need to protect it. But, I'm an American, so the rhetoric of protecting the family has an entirely different meaning to me. 18th, everyone has the right to freedom of thought, consciousness, and religion, including to change beliefs and religion, and to manifest these beliefs in teachings, practice, worship, and observance. 19th, everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression, including the right to opinions without interference, and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through media regardless of the frontier. And 20th, everyone has the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association and cannot be compelled to belong to any association. So, these ones are largely about beliefs and faiths and protecting those, which, again, makes sense. 21st, everyone has the right to take part in the governance of their country, either directly or through freely chosen representatives. Also, the will of the people shall be the basis of authority of the government, which is to be expressed in periodic, genuine elections in which everyone is allowed to vote and be through either secret votes or through other forms of free voting. Everyone also has the right to equal access of public services. 22nd, everyone has the right to Social Security as entitled to economic, social, and cultural rights required for their dignity and free development. 23rd, everyone has the right to work, make free employment choices, to just and favorable working conditions, protection against unemployment, equal pay for equal work, just and favorable remuneration, ensuring for themselves and their family an existence worthy of human dignity, and supplemented, if necessary, by other means of protection, if necessary. And everyone also has the right to unionize. By the way, make sure that you form a union. So, also, again, if you live in the US, you should be sweating bullets right now, because that was like a whole list of things of like, what is the US not like doing? Like some of the usual suspects of like paying people fair living, well, fair wage, not paying, like white men significantly more than anyone else. Uh, let's look here. Yeah, and then also like protections against unemployment. Like the U.S. does not like doing most of these things that are like deemed by the international community to be like extremely important and human rights. Anyways, um, 24th, everyone has the right to rest and leisure, including reasonable limitations of working hours and periodic holidays with pay. So you heard me right. Holiday pay is a human right. Bring that up at your next staff meeting. And 25th, everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of themselves and their family, including food, clothing, housing, medical care, and if necessary, social services, and also the right to security in the case of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood beyond their control. And also motherhood and childhood ought to be entitled to special care and assistance, whether it is in or out of wedlock. So, it doesn't specify exactly what those extra care, like what extra care should be taken, but it's the UN basically being like, hey, like you understand that like pregnant women shouldn't just be fucking gassed, right? Because that was a thing that we had to go over with everyone at the end of World War II. Because everyone was gassing pregnant women. Fuck it. This is a lot, but it's also very important. We only have 4 left, though. So, 26th, everyone has the right to education. Education shall be free in the fundamental and elementary stages as compulsory, while technical and professional education is to be made generally available, with higher education equally accessible. Education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality and to strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedom. And hey, well, I will bang the rules for once. Also, it should promote understanding, tolerance, friendship amongst nations, racial or religious groups, and further the activities of the UN to maintain peace. And fuck, there I go, losing my good standing. Anyways, parents also gain the right to choose the kind of education to give their children. 27th, everyone has the right to participate in the cultural life of their community, enjoying the arts, and to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. Also, everyone has the right to the protection of the moral and material interests resulting from any scientific, literary, or artistic productions of which they're the creator. So, like, copyright stuff is also a human right. 28th, everyone is entitled to social and international order in which the rights and freedoms granted can be fully realized. And finally, 29th, everyone has the duty to uphold human rights and is only subject to limitations as is determined by law to be solely for the purpose of securing due recognition and respect for the rights and freedoms of others and meeting the requirements of morality, public order, and public well-being. And also, you can't use these laws to loophole your way out of following them. Holy shit. But this last one is basically just making sure you can still have laws while not just completely missing the entire point of having the list of human rights. But, that's your list. So, how do we enforce these rules? Well, simply put, poorly. So, every 4 years, the UN's Human Rights Council does a universal periodic review of its member states, of which there's 193, who share measures that they've taken to protect human rights, challenges they face in upholding them, and their commitment to international obligations. Which at first, I thought was all that happened. However, that's not it, because independent experts consistently monitor nations to report on and advise on human rights that are assigned to mandates in 3-year intervals. Currently, there's a total of 60 mandates, 14 national ones and 46 thematic ones. So the national ones are just like targeted at specific nations, which, man, that's such like a slap in the face. But you kind of need to do it sometimes. The thematic ones would be stuff like people of African descent, people with disabilities. Like there's a broad focus. And as essentially the sword arm of this is an investigative body that looks into reported violations. If a legal system fails to protect human rights, then an international court takes over and rules on it. And if a nation continues to act against human rights or deny the result of the court's ruling, they're subjected to dire consequences. Which really means sanctions, trade blockades, and maybe an invasion. Scary. Now, why am I being a dickhead about that? Well, because you gotta think about who the attack dogs are. Because sure, sanctions are great when it's a nation relying on your international aid, like North Korea. They become less effective when the person you need to sanction is a close trade ally that sure relies on you for their economy, but you also deeply rely on them. Like China or the United Arab Emirates, or one of their allies. And the same with blockades, but it becomes extra hard to navigate because of the US. Because we by and large have one of the biggest and most effective fighting forces in the world, at least in straight up war. So, could you get the US to blockade a nation's ports? Yeah, but it's going to cost you, and we're going to complain about it the whole time, and we're not going to blockade one of our allies. Only enemy and neutral parties with land that looks submissive and colonizable. And invasion? Yeah, not going to happen at all, probably. Because the biggest dog the UN has is us, America. And we haven't gone to war with another nation in decades and have an aging military and soldiers that makes it a lot harder for us to go to war. Add on to the fact that getting the US involved basically is just asking for World War III, which literally no one wants. No one. So unless it's like Holocaust levels bad, it's probably not going to happen. And even then, it very well might not happen because it's a major and powerful nation doing it, or a major and powerful nation's ally doing it. They'll just kind of get brushed off. See Israel and Palestine right now. So with that, let's go to history. So like most of our timelines, we begin in the ancient Middle East. Kinda. Really in all the usual, like, pre-2000 BC suspects. Ancient Mesopotamia, the Middle East, ancient Greece, and ancient China, with most of the first legal systems being formed around vaguely the same time, describing the rights of men, women, children, and slaves, usually in that order of importance. Ancient Egypt itself had some basic human rights, like what we'd see today, largely around human life having value and needing to be respected. And by the 6th century BC, Pharaoh Bacchus, it's like I think it's a Latin name, promoted individual rights, shut down debtor prisons, and reformed how land transfers happened to make them more equitable. And in the 6th century BC, also, Cyrus the Great of Persia created massive jumps forward for human rights, namely allowing Jews to move back to Israel and a general freedom of religion for all faiths. Maybe. There's also evidence that this was 19th century political propaganda. Regardless, meanwhile in ancient Greece, we have what's broadly considered to be the start of the idea of citizenship, where free citizens, being largely city dwellers, could have their voices heard and be able to speak their minds openly. And they could also vote. And pretty quickly from there, we move on to Rome, where they create their 12 tables, which is a fuck ton of fanfare over some fucking dining room furniture, so luckily it's not that. Instead, these are the foundational laws of Roman civilization, one of which was privileges shall not be impeded. which has become a staple of a lot of Western law since. Also, these tables granted them additional rights if they were free, of course, like the right to vote, get married, and open businesses or to hold public office if they were a full free citizen. And Antonius Pius introduced the presumption of innocence, while Constantine the Great established freedom of religion. Also, one of the ancient Roman philosophers, Tertullian, penned a term that basically translates to human rights in a letter to Scapula. So, as you can see early on, even though we don't yet have the idea that all people are people, we do at the very least have the idea that citizens are people and deserve rights for just being alive. Which, compared to the standard narrative that human rights are a new thing, is pretty fucking advanced, right? Somewhere between 268 and 232 BC, Emperor Ashoka of the Maurya Empire, that's in India, by the way, adopts Buddhism after a massively devastating war called the Kalinga War. Seeing the horrors of it and realizing that maybe empire building was a bit too bloody, he did a ton of humanitarian reforms fighting against religious discrimination, cruelty to humans and animals, and also introduced a lot of improvements to better conditions for prisoners of war and repealing most, if not all, slavery. Couldn't find an exact description on the last one, but at the very least, he reduced slavery by a lot, which is something at least. By the 600s AD, early Islam and Muhammad, yes, hear that name and fear wasps, increased social reforms and preached against the evils of the day. And was that white babies, the love between a man and a woman, and fried chicken like that country song says? No, it was slavery, a lack of social security and good family structures, inequality for women and ethnic minorities, low social mobility, exploitation of women and the poor, false contracts, and rampant crime. Hey, sounds like they're on your side, bud. Anyways, in 622, Muhammad creates the Constitution of Medina with the elders of the Yathrib to end intertribal violence between the Aus and Khazraj, giving additional rights to Muslims, Jews, and pagans alike. Also, as a consequence of this, slave and prisoner reforms were done, granting them additional protections on some level, and on some levels banning slavery. In the European Middle Ages, the concept of natural law began to emerge, where humans are afforded some human rights by virtue of being the children of God. Amongst the biggest proponents of this would be St. Augustine, examining the differences between the laws of man and God and determining what rights ought to be given for simply existing. And helping with that would be the 1215 signing of the Magna Carta, which added a number of rights and established common law traditions that are still in effect across a lot of British former colonies to this day, with arguably the most important being habeas corpus, allowing for appeal against unlawful imprisonment and the right of due process. Also in 1264, Poland grants the Jewish minority protections, including protection from hate speech, which is one of the earliest one of the earliest things we have evidence for of protection against hate speech. The medieval world was not as closed-minded and conservative as a lot of you people think it is. It's just straight up not. There's a lot of parts of it that are more progressive than today. Anyways, in 1414 also not to say that they were necessarily very good. It's just people were people back then too. Anyways, in 1414 to 1418, the Council of Constantine occurs, where, and forgive me, Polish people, Paweł what the fuck is this last name? Wlodkowic. Fuck that last name. Gives an address advocating for peaceful coexistence between all faiths, including pagans. Around the same time, in the 15th and 16th centuries, due to the conquest of the Americas by the Spanish, we began to debate human rights all over again with more fervor, which results which resulted in the laws of Burgos being passed, which prevented child labor, increased the rights of women, increased wages, talked about suitable accommodations, rest and vacation, and a bunch of other rights. And this was in part inspired by the Christmas sermon given by Friar Antonio de Montesinos of the Dominican Order in New Spain, or in the Americas. In the 17th and 18th centuries, many philosophers, including notables like John Locke, helped to further the debate of natural and human rights. For John Locke in particular, natural rights were divinely derived, seeing as we're God's chosen people and all, which then became an important piece of the argument for human rights and established that no matter how powerful, it's not up to you to decide who gets what rights. In 1689, the English Bill of Rights is passed and asserts basic human rights, notably the freedom from cruel and unusual punishment, which again sticks around in most of their colonies. In the 1700s, novels like Virtue Rewarded and New Heloise begins to set the foundations for the public to begin debating human rights. And with the U.S.'s Declaration of Independence in 1776, it marks an additional stride in human rights, followed by the Bill of Rights in 1789. In the same year, the French Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen describes both individual and collective rights, making them universal rather than specific to the French. All of that massively increasing the public perception of the idea of human rights, and also were massive leaps forward and been cited by revolutionaries in the 1700s to the 1900s as their inspiration for how they've written their own declarations. But following this, through the 18th and 19th centuries, a lot of thinkers and philosophers have taken notes from the French and continue to expand thoughts on universal rights. Well, French and the Americans. I'm going to give us a little bit of credit, because this is one of the places where we do deserve some credit. For as bad at maintaining human rights that America is now, for centuries we tried. And we weren't good at it back then either, but we, philosophically added a lot to the conversation. But anyways, so some of the people expanding on universal rights would be like Thomas Paine in The Rights of Man, or in 1831 when William Lloyd Garrison wrote an article in The Liberator, urging readers to fight for human rights, both of which are claimed to be responsible for the terminology of human rights. Or Thoreau's 1849 on the duty of civil disobedience, about how you shouldn't pay your taxes if the government is violating your rights, which influences the crusade for human and civil rights worldwide, especially in the term of nonviolence. In 1864, under the Lieber Code, the Red Cross is founded, which we covered in the war episode, was a massive step for human rights and general decency between humans. 3 years later, while in the middle of the Civil War, the U.S. Supreme Court rules on the ex parte Milligan, which is the practice of trying civilians under military court, even when civilian courts are available. And yes, this is the military justifying executing civilians, which was luckily deemed unconstitutional, and Court Justice David Davis, wild fucking name by the way, said, "By the protection of the law, human rights are secured. Withdraw that protection, and they are at the mercy of wicked rulers or the clamor of an excited people." The more things change, huh? The more things change. Anyways, after the Civil War, and most other nations managed to figure out how to get rid of slavery without killing most of the population, the 1878 Treaty of Berlin is signed, which bans slavery and offers protection to minorities worldwide. uh, surprise, surprise, guess who violated that treaty pretty often? Um, in 1891, back when the Catholic Church was pretending to care about people, they began their social teachings, which are attempts at humanitarianism. And the first set was focused on workers' rights, property rights, and citizen rights against state intrusions. Into the 20th century, many strides are made in human rights again, especially in terms of suffrage, labor unions, global decolonization, and civil rights victories. Of course, victories written in blood, but victories nonetheless. Like after World War I, the League of Nations was founded to not only disarm each other, but to prevent future wars, decolonize, and settle national disputes, while also increasing global welfare and diplomacy. They also swore to maintain rights that eventually evolved into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in the same year, the International Labor Organization was founded, setting its sight on discrimination against pregnant women in the workplace. In 1921, feeling that they'd done their part, the ILO changed its focus to the rights of agricultural workers, and then 9 years later shifted to prevent forced labor. And then we get World War II, where the world learned that honor and platitudes would do nothing to stop human rights abuses, especially at the hands of people who don't care about honor and will lie to your face. And World War II was filled with so many war crimes and abuses of human rights throughout by all sides. But the Nazis were the worst. And if you disagree, have fun at Ghost Club. I'll see you outside with a shotgun, motherfucker. That many of the nations involved chose to rededicate themselves to upholding human rights. Kind of mostly, but still. And this is when we cross over with the Geneva Conventions from the war episode. And in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was established by international experts drawing from politics, philosophy, and religion. Which is kind of what we went over earlier. And then, finally, for this timeline, in 1975, the Helsinki Accords are signed, which include quite a lot of rededicating nations to the good fight, which was signed by 35 European nations, and I believe the United States, with exceptions of Andorra and Albania. So they're allowed to commit war crimes. And we continue the fight to this day. So let's talk about right now. Alrighty. So we're going to be starting off defining the Human Rights Index and talking about the scores of the nations. So the Human Rights Index is a 0 to 1 scale, with the average for worldwide human rights being 0.66. And this is mostly through the VDEM index, which is how much democracy and freedom of choice that nation has. Which sure doesn't necessarily measure a lot of the abuses, but is a good generalization. For the 10 highest nations, in a 7-way tie, is Estonia, New Zealand, Sweden, Denmark, Ireland, Belgium, and Finland, all at 0.96. Meaning they are almost at the very top of personal freedom. And the last 3 places are Switzerland, Czechia, and Iceland at 0.95. And for the low end of the index, the worst one is North Korea at 0.02, second is Afghanistan at 0.05, and third is Eritrea at 0.06. Tied at 4th and 5th would be Turkmenistan and Burma at 0.11. Nicaragua and Syria are tied at 6th and 7th at 0.13. 8th is Laos at 0.15. And tied at 9th and 10th are China and Saudi Arabia at 0.17. Which contains a lot of the usual suspects. And where's the US rank? Well, you might be surprised, but somewhere in the upper quarter at 0.93. I will say, America, fuck yeah. Which, hey, also, that's pretty good. Oh, and also, fun fact, in 1942, Germany wasn't at the bottom of the list. Yeah. It was at 0.03. Instead, the honor of the worst human rights It goes to Russia, Uzbekistan, Moldova, Latvia, Kazakhstan, Estonia, Belarus, Lithuania, Georgia, and Azerbaijan, aka the Soviet Union. Yeah, either the Soviet Union was real fucking rough, or this index has some issues. But anyways, with our high score, we must really not have much in the way of human rights violations going on, right? Well, no. Because, see, in the US, we have a good number of issues. So, I mean, first is massive discrimination against everyone that isn't a WASP, which is a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. In particular, against Latinos, black people, Native Americans, Jews, Arabs, and the LGBTQ. As well as, like, well, I mean, trans people are part of the LGBTQ. But I mean, also, like, I guess pagans, but paganism is not really that popular. Again, basically anyone that's not WASP. We also have the recent loss of reproductive rights, with millions upon millions of women being denied basic fucking gynecological health care, contraception, or abortion, including outright bans, but also preventing government programs from paying for abortion. On top of high amounts of sexual violence, especially against Native American women, with 56% experiencing sexual violence, and amongst them, 96% were victimized by a non-native. And because of jurisdictional limitations, because technically reservations are kind of sorta not the US, they can't often receive justice and are often blocked from having rape kits done. Also, highly limited and discriminatory refugee and migrant laws and rights are also like a huge deal, which is something that we've covered before. That most people can't even get asylum, and the amount of abuse that refugees and migrants get is astronomical. Especially things like with the Afghan adjustment not passing, meaning that Afghan evacuees that helped us in the war in the Middle East are now being stranded in a country whose rulers know that they helped us, and also are very high on that list of the worst human rights violations in the world. Oh, and also 4 states have made peaceful assembly and protest restrictions, in the form of laws banning protests near pipelines, protests to block traffic, and violence committed by really anyone anywhere near the protest being put on the foot of the protesters. And Mississippi now requires permission to protest near government structures. And we've also been flagged by the UN for our excessive police violence and use of the death penalty and the arbitrary detention, especially in relation to Guantanamo Bay. And other nations have asked us to be flagged for our constant gun violence in violation of the right to life and security. Oh, that's not even mentioning our unlawful killings overseas, especially with drone strikes and unpunished war crimes, including executing prisoners of war, which the US gets away with because the US does a whole lot of the enforcement of human rights. And finally, unhealthy environments and pollution. I mean, we spill a fuck ton of oil, gas, and pollution all over the place. Smog is fairly common, although not the most common in the world, and microplastics are everywhere, and we have constant gas fumes and like chemical leaks that just fuck up our health. But okay, this isn't to say that there isn't anything you can do. So, what can you do to stand up for human rights? Well, firstly, no matter what anyone tells you, you're free to report violations at any time. Mind, they'll ask that you exhaust the local and national options first, but you can still report it. So beyond that, what's your options? Well, first, speak about things you care about and stand up for them. Set aside time to dedicate to issues you find important and what you need to do to help. Even if it's just advocacy and being a platform for people to tell their stories. Volunteer or donate to an organization working to solve the problem. Make sure it's a reputable one, mind. But if you find one, organizations that work for human rights are a great way to go. Also, shop fair trade, ethically produced and sourced, and for gemstones that are lab grown. By voting with your wallet, you can help make some of the human rights abusing practices more expensive than they're worth. Which is fucked. But remember that corporations can and will abuse your rights for a buck if it's cheaper than the alternative. Also, listen to and share the stories of others. Stay connected to and involved in social movements and fight discrimination wherever you find it. Also, research issues you feel passionate about and work to get a deeper understanding of it. Now, of course, do good research. Obviously, no source is perfect. Eighth, put pressure on your elected officials and governments to uphold human rights and protest inequality wherever it lives. And finally, support the rights of the most vulnerable and find and help to find solutions for them to stand for themselves, like people in poverty or suffering with disabilities or racial inequality. And yes, that's a lot of hard work, but we need to not give up and backtrack, because that's when we get into deeper shit. So, quickly, let's hop over the soapbox. And I feel like you know where the soapbox is going. We've made a lot of progress in the realms of human rights over the last century. In fact, we've been at it for millennia. But that doesn't mean we can give up. Not even close. This is one of those things that we have to keep fighting for, no matter how hard or how long we fight. As we've seen in America, a moment of complacency means decades of progress lost. Because as much as we might fight for our rights, there's always someone there to take them. But that's not the end of the bad news, folks. Because as much as I say that there's something you can do, it's only while people who respect democracy and human rights are in positions of power. Because the only thing stopping a nation like the US from violating your human rights is having a name that doesn't sound ethnic, and the amount of bad press I'd get from caving your face in with a drone strike or abusing your butthole in the Cuban cuddle bunker. And sure, I say those things in funny ways, but this is legitimately horrifying. If the US behaves badly enough, what can anyone do about it? The US is world police and have been leaned on for that duty for decades. And anyone who can stand against us probably wouldn't want to, because they're also monsters. Like Russia, China, or the UAE. And that's even if they could. They might not be able to. So while I wish I had anything hopeful to say to you, the only hope we have is to fill our government with good people and anti-fascists before it's too late. So, yeah, let's get out of here. Fuck me, that was terrifying, huh? Please keep up the good fight, y'all. Anyways, if you have opinions, advice on how to make the show better, why you don't think human rights are important, your own stories about human rights issues, and really anything else you want to tell me, make sure to email me at waytatpods@gmail.com. That is waytatpods@gmail.com. Remember to check out my other podcast, Waytat Nerd, where I do basically the same thing with nerd topics like fantasy, sci-fi, role-playing games, etc., where I hope you'll like the topics just as much. And also remember to follow me on Twitter at waytat_pods for more episode announcements and maybe sometimes some rants. Alright. Have a good night. Don't murder. Have fun. And remember, don't hesitate to kick a human rights denier in the entire cock and balls. This has been Why Are You Talking About This? I've been your host, William. Good night.